They didn't expect her to show up. Not after what they did to her, not after 2 years of silence, erased emails and whispers that said she was unstable. Most people in that courtroom had already decided who she was before she walked in. A disgraced former court clerk, a bitter woman with a folder full of complaints and no real case. But when Amara Lewis stepped through those doors, something shifted. Not loudly, but just enough that even the stenographer stopped typing. The judge's voice sliced through the stillness like a blade. "Ms. Lewis, we expect this hearing to proceed without spectacle," he said, not bothering to look at her directly. His words weren't loud, but they were heavy with rehearsed authority. The kind of voice used to being obeyed, not questioned. Amara didn't respond right away. Her eyes remained forward, unfazed. The murmur in the courtroom had settled into a low buzz behind her, like the sound of a waiting crowd unsure whether to watch a trial or a public shaming. She adjusted the folder on her lap. Clean, worn edges, the only thing she'd held onto from the 2 years of silence that followed her firing. Cutler finally met her gaze. "Do you have anything to say before we begin?" She inhaled, slow, measured. "I do." A few people in the gallery leaned forward. A reporter's pen paused mid-sentence. "I didn't lie," she said quietly, "and I didn't deserve to be erased." The words weren't loud, but they landed like a dropped weight. The clerk looked up for the first time. The bailiff shifted. Cutler leaned back unimpressed. "This is not the place to relitigate your emotions." "No," Amara said, "it's the place to expose yours." A few seconds of silence passed, thick enough to feel. He cleared his throat. "Watch your tone, Ms. Lewis." She didn't flinch. "I have." He raised his brow, feigning curiosity. "You were a junior clerk. Your duties were administrative." "I remember every file I touched, every red mark that disappeared, every transcript edited after the hearing was over." "That's a bold accusation," he said, lips twitching in an almost smile. "You do realize the weight of slandering a sitting judge?" Amara blinked slowly. "I'm not the one who edited the record. I'm just the one who refused to forget it." His face stiffened, just slightly, barely noticeable to most. But the woman in the back row, Amara saw her lower her phone slowly, like she hadn't expected this to be anything more than another courtroom loss. A young intern by the jury box stopped typing. For a moment, even the lights felt colder. Cutler tried to regain pace. "You filed a complaint through improper channels because every proper channel led back to your office. That's conjecture," he snapped, "and reckless." Amara leaned forward just slightly. "No, Your Honor. What's reckless is sentencing a young black man with no record and no defense evidence in under 6 minutes. His lips parted, just a fraction. The murmurs rose again. The courtroom didn't erupt. It leaned in. "I was there," she continued, steady, "when you asked for the race of the defendant before reading the charges. I was there when the mother cried outside your door." Cutler's hand hovered near his gavel, but didn't drop. Not yet. Amara tilted her head, voice low. "That's not in the transcript either, is it?" A beat. Then he said, quieter than before, "This hearing will continue in order." She nodded once. "Of course." Her hands folded in her lap. The folder remained unopened, but the air had shifted. Not enough to change the trial, but just enough to make everyone else see what she'd always seen, who held the power and how they used it. No outburst, no yelling, just one woman choosing not to be smaller than the room built to break her. And one man, in a robe, realizing the silence around him wasn't loyalty. It was fear, and it was starting to vanish. The judge didn't speak right away. His eyes hovered over Amara, then drifted to the bailiff, who stood unnaturally still. The room, still thick with the echo of her last words, seemed unsure whether to breathe or brace. Somewhere near the back, a phone vibrated against a wooden bench, and no one moved to silence it. I'll remind you, Judge Cutler said finally, his voice thinner now, less anchored, that courtroom decorum is not optional. Amara didn't blink. Neither is truth. A quiet gasp came from a woman seated in the gallery. One of the law interns looked toward the exit, unsure whether to leave or stay. Cutler adjusted his robe, a nervous tick more than a necessity. This isn't about your feelings, it's about process. Amara nodded. And process has a habit of failing people who look like me. His jaw tightened. That's a dangerous thing to say. No, she said softly. It's dangerous that it keeps being true. The clerk scribbled something, then paused. The pen in his hand hovered, his eyes meeting. Amara's for a split second before dropping again. Something in the room had shifted, not loud, but real. Cutler leaned in. You were fired for violating internal policy, not because of race. Let's not rewrite history. She turned her head slightly. I never said I was fired because I'm black. I said the policies were built to protect men like you. That landed. Cutler looked away, if only for a second. Not because he was wrong, but because she had spoken aloud what everyone had been too conditioned to say. The silence afterward stretched longer than it should have. In it, the court reporter stopped typing again. Her hands rested still on the keys. Amara broke the stillness. I was told to let it go. That fighting this would ruin me. Cutler exhaled through his nose as if bored. And yet here you are, still playing victim. She held his gaze. Not a victim, a witness. The bailiff shifted his feet. The courtroom doors creaked as someone slipped in. Heads turned, but Amara kept her eyes forward. Cutler reached for his gavel but hesitated. It wasn't time yet. Or maybe he didn't know how to end something that no longer obeyed him. Amara's voice lowered, firm but almost tired. I gave the system every chance to correct itself. All I got back were threats, silence, and a pink slip. He smirked, but it didn't reach his eyes. You made your choice. She nodded once. So did you. Then nothing. No gavel, no rebuttal. Just the weight of what wasn't being said. And for the first time, the courtroom didn't belong to him. It just watched. The creak of the courtroom doors cut through Judge Cutler's voice like a blade through fabric. His sentence halted mid-air, not because he chose to stop, but because the room no longer belonged to him. The echo of heels followed, slow, deliberate, echoing off marble with the kind of weight only certain men carry. Cutler straightened in his chair, eyes narrowing at the center aisle. If this is an interruption, I suggest it end now. No response. Not a word. Not even a glance from the figure moving closer. The bailiff looked once, then instinctively stepped aside, not from instruction, from memory, from recognition. Amara's shoulders rose with her breath, but she didn't turn around, her eyes closed. Not in fear, but in knowing, the kind of knowing that sits in your bones when you've waited for something to arrive for too long. Cutler cleared his throat, louder now. Bailiff, remove any unauthorized... Sit down, Raymond. The voice came steady, low, not a threat, a command. Cutler froze. The gavel in his hand stopped mid-reach. His mouth opened slightly, then closed. A slight tremor ran through his jaw. He didn't look angry. Not yet. He looked small. The figure stepped into full view. Military dress uniform, polished shoes, ribbons aligned perfectly. Colonel David Lewis didn't shout. He didn't smile. He didn't need to. Amara still hadn't turned, but her lips pressed together, firm. Her posture softened, only slightly. The storm was here. She didn't have to carry it alone anymore. Is this some kind of coordinated... Cutler tried, but the words landed flat. No one met his eye. Not the clerk. Not the audience. Not even the court reporter, whose hands hovered, waiting for something more important to type. Colonel Lewis approached the bench without rushing. He set down a sealed envelope on the clerk's desk. By federal authority, he said calmly, this bench is now subject to oversight. Cutler's fingers tapped the armrest. You don't have jurisdiction. Section 47, the colonel interrupted, voice still level. You know what that means. The judge's face twitched, the faint twitch of a man who'd once memorized the rule book but never thought it would be used against him. He didn't speak again, and no one asked questions, because the room had already decided it wasn't his courtroom anymore. Amara opened her eyes. Her gaze didn't move to her father. She didn't need to look. He wasn't there for attention. He was there to end what she'd already started, and the silence that followed didn't ask for permission. It just settled in, like truth that had finally entered the room. She hadn't thought about that office in a long time, not fully. But now, seated in a courtroom with her truth on trial, the memories came back without asking. It started with the numbers. Amara was in early that morning, coffee cooling beside a case folder. A routine check, just cross-referencing fee processing reports with dispersals. She wasn't looking for anything, but found everything. Victim restitution payments marked complete, yet no signatures. Court fees filed under urgent override, bypassed approvals. She flagged them, highlighted the discrepancies, sent a clean professional email with the subject, follow-up, incomplete transactions. No response. 2 days later, she noticed something else. A transcript from a preliminary hearing was missing a paragraph. The defendant, black, 17, no prior record, had been denied a public defender mid-session. Amara remembered the judge's exact words. She'd typed them herself in her case notes. But in the final document, that moment never happened. She checked the database again. Same thing. Objections from the defense scrubbed. Prosecutor's mistake removed. Witness hesitation gone. When she asked IT to retrieve the first version, they said there was none. Must be a file error, the supervisor mumbled. Not uncommon, but his eyes didn't meet hers when he said it. She submitted a formal memo. Irregularities in judicial procedure. Attached screenshots, dates, time logs. The next day, her access was revoked. She was moved to a side desk near the break room. No explanation, no notice. Her name vanished from case routing. Her supervisor started using a clipboard instead of email. Just trying to reduce clutter, he said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Then came the misconduct notice. Unauthorized data review. Violation of clerk confidentiality. Signed by 2 people who hadn't been in the office in months. She knew their names. Knew the signatures were copied. She sat at her desk that day and stared at the paper. Not angry, not scared, just quiet. That's when Mr. Harold passed by with his mop. He didn't stop, just walked slowly, pausing only long enough to say, "You're too loud for a place built on whispers." Amara looked up. His face was tired, kind. He didn't smile, but there was something in his eyes. Something that said, "You're not crazy." That was the first real confirmation she ever got. There was no confrontation, no moment where someone screamed at her or pointed a finger. That would have been too obvious. Instead, her calendar slowly emptied. Her login reset weekly. Meetings happened without her. The assistant who used to say good morning now passed without eye contact. She walked by Judge Cutler once in the hallway. He didn't acknowledge her. But as she passed, she caught the corner of a printout in his hand. Her memo. Page 1. He crumpled it without stopping. That night, Amara sat on the floor of her apartment, the air cold, her body exhausted. She didn't cry. She didn't speak. She opened her laptop and started writing every detail down. Not to send, just to remember. Because if they could bury a memo, they could bury a whole life. She remembered when she first got the job. Her father had shaken her hand like she'd joined something sacred. "The system isn't perfect," he said, "but being inside means you can change it." Now, she knew better. Being inside didn't mean power. It meant proximity to silence. And those who kept quiet the longest were rewarded the most. Still, she didn't leave. Not right away. She stayed another month, collecting copies, saving backups, emailing files to herself from coffee shops on her lunch breaks. She learned to speak less, listen more, and walk like she didn't notice the cameras. When they let her go, it wasn't with a bang. Just a manila envelope and a closed door. She didn't fight it. Not then. She wasn't ready. But she remembered everything. Every missing line, every erased sentence, every look that said, "Don't make this harder than it has to be." And now, sitting in court, all those whispers echoed again. Not as ghosts, but as evidence. She had been loud in the wrong place. Now she was loud in the right one. The first time she called the reporter, he let it ring twice before sending her to voicemail. The second time, he answered, but said he was between deadlines. The third time, he didn't answer at all. That was 3 years ago. Now, on the eve of testimony, he texted her one line. "We're ready now. Not I'm sorry. Not you were right. Just that." Amara read the message without emotion. She'd long stopped hoping for apologies, but something in those 3 words felt like a quiet admission, not of guilt, but of cowardice finally giving way to consequence. She tucked her phone into her coat pocket and walked toward the courthouse library. The air was heavy with fog, and the weight of people finally realizing the world around them had never been neutral. Inside, she sat across from an ex-internal affairs officer. He had aged since she last saw him. The once proud posture of a career man now folded over a styrofoam coffee cup. He kept his voice low, like someone still afraid of being overheard, even in a near-empty room. "We thought we were protecting the court," he said, eyes on the rim of his cup. "Really, we were just protecting each other." Amara didn't respond. She didn't need to. The silence between them did the work. He continued. "It wasn't just one case. We looked the other way for years. Because once you name it, you can't unsee it." She nodded slowly. "You saw enough." He hesitated. "I saw everything." In her bag, she kept a flash drive. Dates, names, pulled records, the work of late nights and borrowed printers. She hadn't given it to anyone yet, but she would. Soon. At home that night, she sat on the floor and played the voicemail again. The woman's voice cracked halfway through. "My son ain't perfect, but they made him disappear. They just made him disappear." The call had come 6 weeks after Amara was fired. No one else had returned the woman's messages. Amara never forgot her name, or the silence that followed her call. She closed her eyes as the message played again, letting the ache sink in, not out of punishment, but remembrance. That was what this was all for. Not revenge, not fame, just not forgetting. She had emailed the intake clerk, too, the one who used to scribble small letters on the back of case files. Amara remembered seeing a B in pencil, faint, like it didn't want to exist. She'd asked once, casually, what it meant. The woman looked up, blinked, and said, "Just an internal code." Now, in her email reply, she finally admitted it. "It was for race. I was told it helped the docket flow smoother. I never questioned it. Until now." Amara read that message twice. Not because she didn't believe it, but because it was the first time someone who had watched it happen also said it out loud. And that mattered. In the courthouse hallway the next morning, a young intern stopped her, eyes hesitant. "Ms. Lewis," she said quietly, "I found an old file in the shred bin yesterday. It had the wrong timestamp. I emailed it to your attorney." Amara stared at her. The girl looked down, fidgeting with her ID badge. "I'm sorry I didn't say anything sooner," she whispered. Amara didn't say, "Thank you." She didn't say, "It's okay." She just said, "You said it now." Because sometimes truth comes late. but late is still louder than never. In the elevator, Amara caught her reflection. Not polished, not angry, just steady. Worn from the years, but standing. They had buried everything in policy, but she had remembered. Every timestamp, every missing paragraph, every door that closed just a little too quietly. Now they were remembering too. Not with press conferences, not with tearful confessions, but with brief nods, paused hands, shaky voices. The cracks had started, and this time, no one rushed to cover them. It started before the judge entered. A ripple, not panic, but tension. Cameras set up earlier than usual. Reporters whispering tighter. Courtroom benches packed shoulder to shoulder. Faces that weren't there the day before now leaning in, waiting. Not for justice, but for something to finally happen. The bailiff walked in with a brown envelope, plain and folded flat. He held it like it might burn. No return address. Just the word play scribbled in block letters on a flash drive inside. He handed it to the clerk, who looked at it, then at Amara, then back at the judge. The folder sat unopened for a beat too long. Judge Cutler didn't even lift his eyes. "We are not entertaining anonymous theater," he said, voice firm. "Proceed as scheduled." But no one moved. The clerk, usually robotic, swallowed hard. His fingers hovered above the keyboard like they were trying to decide whether this was their final act of loyalty or their first act of truth. Amara watched it unfold from her seat, her hands folded over her lap. She didn't speak. She didn't smile. But something in her body had changed, a shift so small it was almost invisible. The stillness before a thunderclap. The clerk inserted the flash drive. The screen blinked, then lit up. At first, it looked like nothing, just a folder marked with dates, then video files, then audio, then emails. The courtroom fell silent, not out of confusion, out of recognition. One by one, the images played. Cutler's email approving sentencing drafts before the cases had even been heard. Transcripts altered after hearings. Internal chat logs from staffers mocking defendants by race, laughing about how some files were cleaner without the objections. Each one stamped, time-coded, verified. Cutler's voice recorded saying, "If they're not guilty of this, they're guilty of something." Someone in the back gasped. A phone clattered to the floor. The bailiff stepped forward, leaned into the judge's bench, whispered, "Sir, you need to see this." Cutler grabbed the gavel, slammed it once. "Turn it off, now!" The clerk didn't move. He just stared at the screen, jaw locked. "Turn it off!" the judge barked. Still, nothing. Amara looked around. The jury box wasn't full, but every face present had turned pale. The reporter who had once dismissed her sat with his mouth open. The court reporter had stopped typing again, her hands folded in her lap, eyes fixed forward. One of the monitors in the back blinked again, and the same footage started playing. Then another screen, then another. Every courtroom screen lit up, each one mirroring the others. The same recordings.
They had buried everything in policy. But she had remembered every timestamp, every missing paragraph, every door that closed just a little too quietly. Now they were remembering too, not with press conferences, not with tearful confessions, but with brief nods, paused hands, shaky voices. The cracks had started, and this time no one rushed to cover them. It started before the judge entered. A ripple, not panic, but tension. Cameras set up earlier than usual, reporters whispering tighter. Courtroom benches packed shoulder to shoulder, faces that weren't there the day before now leaning in, waiting, not for justice, but for something to finally happen. The bailiff walked in with a brown envelope, plain and folded flat. He held it like it might burn. No return address. Just the word play scribbled in block letters on a flash drive. Inside, he handed it to the clerk, who looked at it, then at Amara, then back at the judge. The folder sat unopened for a beat too long. Judge Cutler didn't even lift his eyes. "We are not entertaining anonymous theater," he said, voice firm. "Proceed as scheduled." But no one moved. The clerk, usually robotic, swallowed hard. His fingers hovered above the keyboard, like they were trying to decide whether this was their final act of loyalty or their first act of truth. Amara watched it unfold from her seat, her hands folded over her lap. She didn't speak, she didn't smile. But something in her body had changed, a shift so small it was almost invisible. The stillness before a thunderclap. The clerk inserted the flash drive. The screen blinked, then lit up. At first, it looked like nothing. Just a folder marked with dates, then video files, then audio, then emails. The courtroom fell silent, not out of confusion, out of recognition. One by one, the images played. Cutler's email approving sentencing drafts before the cases had even been heard. Transcripts altered after hearings. Internal chat logs from staffers mocking defendants by race, laughing about how some files were cleaner without the objections. Each one stamped, time-coded, verified. Cutler's voice recorded saying, "If they're not guilty of this, they're guilty of something." Someone in the back gasped. A phone clattered to the floor. The bailiff stepped forward, leaned into the judge's bench, whispered, "Sir, you need to see this." Cutler grabbed the gavel, slammed it once. "Turn it off, now." The clerk didn't move. He just stared at the screen, jaw locked. "Turn it off." The judge barked. Still, nothing. Amara looked around. The jury box wasn't full, but every face present had turned pale. The reporter who had once dismissed her sat with his mouth open. The court reporter had stopped typing again, her hands folded in her lap, eyes fixed forward. One of the monitors in the back blinked again, and the same footage started playing, then another screen, then another. Every courtroom screen lit up, each one mirroring the others. The same recordings, the same emails, the same evidence. They weren't local files anymore. The video had synced. Someone had gone public, online. It was already everywhere. Cutler stood now, pointing. "This is illegal dissemination of classified court records. Someone will answer for this." But no one answered. His voice, once a tool of command, now echoed without grip. It fell flat, not because he wasn't loud, but because the room had stopped listening. Amara looked at him finally. Not with fire, not with vengeance, just stillness. She didn't say, "I told you so." She didn't say anything because now she didn't have to. Everything she'd tried to show, everything they erased, was showing itself. The armor was cracking, and not from one punch, but from every bruise that came before, from every memo ignored, every testimony buried, every whisper forced into silence. They had buried everything in policy, but she had remembered. Every timestamp, every missing paragraph, every door that closed just a little too quietly. Now they were remembering too. Not with press conferences, not with tearful confessions, but with brief nods, paused hands, shaky voices. The cracks had started, and this time no one rushed to cover them. It started before the judge entered. A ripple, not panic but tension. Cameras set up earlier than usual, reporters whispering tighter. Courtroom benches packed shoulder to shoulder. Faces that weren't there the day before now leaning in, waiting, not for justice, but for something to finally happen. The bailiff walked in with a brown envelope, plain and folded flat. He held it like it might burn. No return address. Just the word, play, scribbled in block letters on a flash drive. Inside. He handed it to the clerk, who looked at it, then at Amara, then back at the judge. The folder sat unopened for a beat too long. Judge Cutler didn't even lift his eyes. "We are not entertaining anonymous theater," he said, voice firm. "Proceed as scheduled." But no one moved. The clerk, usually robotic, swallowed hard. His fingers hovered above the keyboard like they were trying to decide whether this was their final act of loyalty or their first act of truth. Amara watched it unfold from her seat, her hands folded over her lap. She didn't speak. She didn't smile. But something in her body had changed, a shift so small it was almost invisible. The stillness before a thunderclap. The clerk inserted the flash drive. The screen blinked, then lit up. At first, it looked like nothing. Just a folder marked with dates, then video files, then audio, then emails. The courtroom fell silent, not out of confusion, out of recognition. One by one, the images played. Cutler's email approving sentencing drafts before the cases had even been heard. Transcripts altered after hearings. Internal chat logs from staffers mocking defendants by race, laughing about how some files were cleaner without the objections. Each one stamped, time-coded, verified. Cutler's voice recorded saying, "If they're not guilty of this, they're guilty of something." Someone in the back gasped. A phone clattered to the floor. The bailiff stepped forward, leaned into the judge's bench, whispered, "Sir, you need to see this." Cutler grabbed the gavel, slammed it once. "Turn it off, now." The clerk didn't move. He just stared at the screen, jaw locked. "Turn it off." The judge barked. Still, nothing. Amara looked around. The jury box wasn't full, but every face present had turned pale. The reporter who had once dismissed her sat with his mouth open. The court reporter had stopped typing again, her hands folded in her lap, eyes fixed forward. One of the monitors in the back blinked again, and the same footage started playing. Then another screen, then another. Every courtroom screen lit up, each one mirroring the others. The same recordings, the same emails, the same evidence. They weren't local files anymore. The video had synced. Someone had gone public, online. It was already everywhere. Cutler stood now, pointing. "This is illegal dissemination of classified court records. Someone will answer for this." But no one answered. His voice, once a tool of command, now echoed without grip. It fell flat, not because he wasn't loud, but because the room had stopped listening. Amara looked at him, finally. Not with fire, not with vengeance, just stillness. She didn't say, "I told you so." She didn't say anything, because now she didn't have to. Everything she'd tried to show, everything they erased, was showing itself. The armor was cracking, and not from one punch, but from every bruise that came before, from every memo ignored, every testimony buried, every whisper forced into silence. The courtroom didn't need an argument. It had a screen full of truth, and no one could look away. Not anymore. The judge sat straighter, but the robe no longer held weight. It hung on him like fabric instead of title. His eyes scanned the room, searching maybe for an ally, someone to stand, someone to say something, but no one moved. Amara didn't speak. She didn't have to. The screens behind her still glowed. Emails, video files, laughing threads with names and faces. Her name had been dragged through the mud for 2 years, but now it was his that lingered on the evidence. Unedited, undeniable. "You think you're some kind of martyr?" Cutler asked, his voice carrying across the courtroom with less force than he meant. She looked at him, steady. "No," she said. "I'm just not afraid of the truth anymore." It landed quietly, and that made it sharper. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was heavy. The weight of knowing. The weight of every moment that had been dismissed, every warning ignored, every file that went missing while someone got promoted. A phone buzzed in the gallery. No one reached for. Outside, news vans had begun broadcasting live. Inside, the courtroom felt smaller, tighter. Like the building itself had turned its back on the bench. Cutler opened his mouth again but hesitated. His hand moved toward the gavel, then stopped. The bailiff didn't look his way. The clerk busied himself with a pen that didn't need clicking. He exhaled, then spoke. "This is being taken out of context. These files, Amara cut in, calm, crisp. You signed them." His jaw tightened. "I did not authorize public distribution." "But you authorized the rulings. You knew what those signatures meant." He leaned back, robe folding at his sides. "You're twisting this." "No," she replied. "You twisted people." Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. Every word echoed because the room had learned to listen. A reporter in the front row scribbled. Another just stared. Cutler looked down, then up. "I've served this court for 30 years. And how many lives did that service cost?" That stopped him. She didn't press further. She just let it sit. Across the aisle, the court stenographer had stopped typing. Her fingers hovered, then dropped to her lap. She didn't look at the judge. She looked at Amara, and nodded. Cutler saw it. His eyes flicked to the woman, then to the camera light blinking red in the back. The realization crawled in. Not that he'd been caught, but that he'd lost control. He tried again. "This courtroom has protocols. This trial is not. You lost this courtroom the moment you thought it belonged to you." His lips parted. No sound. That silence, that vacuum, was louder than anything she could have shouted. A slow turning of heads began. Reporters, spectators, even the guards near the back. Not toward Amara, but away from him. No one argued. No one stood up. No one needed to. He shifted in his seat. The bench that once made him tall now seemed to push him inward. Amara stepped forward, just one pace. "You remember Mr. Daniels?" she asked. 18. No record. Charged with assault without evidence. You gave him 4 years. He cried when the transcript didn't match. Cutler didn't answer. "His mother died last year." She continued. "Still waiting for an appeal. You never signed." He blinked slowly. A flicker of something. Guilt? No, just exposure. She leaned in slightly. "You buried names. You buried chances. You buried people, and then you buried me. Still nothing." She took a breath. "But I remembered everything." The room stayed still. The screens were frozen now. The final file, an audio clip of Cutler laughing with a colleague, calling a defendant a lost cause. They'd all heard it. They didn't need to replay it. The truth was full now, tangible, recorded. He didn't pick up the gavel. He didn't stand, because nothing he could say would put this back in order. "Amara," stepped back, and the courtroom watched her. Not him, not the judge, just the woman who refused to vanish, just the woman who turned the silence into a mirror and made the whole room see. The boots struck marble like punctuation. Slow, even, final. No announcement, no badge flash, just presence. The room had already seen chaos through flickering screens, but this was something else. No argument, no yelling. Just silence parting like curtains as Colonel David Lewis stepped through the aisle. Cutler sat still, trying not to react too quickly, but his hands gave him away. One gripped the edge of the bench, the other hovered near the gavel, unsure. The Colonel stopped just short of the defense table. He didn't glance at Amara. He didn't need to. His eyes were set on the man in black robes, sitting too tall in a chair that no longer belonged to him. By authority granted to me under Section 47 of the Federal Judiciary Oversight Act. A pause. Deliberate. This trial is over. The words didn't shake the walls, but they made the floor feel different. Like power had shifted, and everyone in the room felt it before they understood it. Cutler opened his mouth, but nothing came. Not even a breath. David Lewis took 2 more steps, then laid a sealed envelope on the clerk's table. The government seal caught the light, gold, embossed, impossible to ignore. Effective immediately, he said. This bench is under federal investigation. No shouting, no camera clicks, no objection from the prosecution, just a vacuum, a collective stillness, a truth no one had prepared for. But all had suspected. Cutler blinked rapidly. His lips twitched, but his throat locked. He looked left. No help. Looked right. The bailiff avoided his gaze. Then, soft as paper folding. You may remove your robe, Judge Cutler. The judge didn't move. You heard him? Someone whispered in the gallery. Cutler finally stood. Not quickly, carefully, like the motion itself hurt. He reached for the clasp near his shoulder, hands trembling slightly. The robe slipped down with more weight than fabric should carry. He folded it once, then again, laid it across the bench. Still, no sound from him. Colonel Lewis remained where he stood, not satisfied, not vindicated, just present, fulfilled in duty. Cutler turned toward the back, unsure if he should leave, unsure if he even could. But no one stopped him. No one stood to block him either. That was the punishment. No resistance, just removal. Amara watched his shadow move across the floor as he passed. She didn't look up, didn't twist in her seat, because this wasn't about revenge, it was about return. Return of balance, of dignity, of weight carried and now transferred. Colonel Lewis remained still, his hands behind his back. He finally turned his head, not fully, just slightly, toward Amara. She didn't meet his eyes, but she nodded. Once, quiet, complete, and he nodded back. That was all. The court reporter sat frozen. The clerk's pen rested on the desk. And somewhere, in the back, someone whispered, "He's really gone." But no one clapped. There was no need. The bench was empty now, and justice didn't roar. It stood. Cutler stood slowly, not to obey, but because the weight of staying seated had become unbearable. His body betrayed him first, not with a collapse, but with a slow unraveling. His knees barely locked. His hands moved with the uncertainty of someone used to being watched with respect, and now only seen with distance. He reached for the edge of his robe, as if unsure how to remove it. The once symbolic garment, worn in the name of law, now sagged in his grip like wet cloth. His fingers trembled as he folded it. Not neatly, not with care, just with the nervous clumsiness of a man being stripped without ever being touched. No one stood for him. The marshals didn't touch his arms. They didn't need to. He walked between them like someone escorted by memory. The memory of every ruling, every silenced objection, every face he never had to meet once the sentence was read. He didn't look at Amara. Couldn't. His eyes scanned the courtroom, maybe hoping someone, anyone, would catch his gaze. But the seats behind the bench stayed still. His wife, always seated second row during his high-profile hearings, was already gone. Her scarf folded neatly on the bench where she once smiled proudly as he passed. Her absence louder than any word. His phone buzzed in his coat pocket as he reached the back. One vibration, then another. He glanced at it, a text from his daughter, the screen lit with only 4 words, "Don't come home." He tucked the phone back inside. He didn't respond. He left through the same door he once entered from, the private one reserved for authority. This time, it didn't shut behind him with dignity. It just closed like any other door. No applause followed, because justice, when it's real, doesn't need to be loud. And then Amara stood, not to follow him, not to speak. She simply rose, and the courtroom, without being asked, followed. One by one they stood with her, not in applause, not to praise, but because something had shifted. Recognition, not of what she'd done, but of what she had withstood. She didn't wave, didn't cry, just picked up her folder and straightened her jacket. No power pose, no performance, only quiet purpose. The same shoes she'd worn when they fired her echoed now, steady and calm, down the aisle that had once felt like a tunnel, and then just before the exit she paused, not to see him, not to soak it in, but to look back at the chair she once sat in. The chair where they had tried to reduce her to paperwork and protocol. The one where her silence had once been mistaken for surrender. It was empty now, and it looked small, because what filled the courtroom now wasn't Cutler's authority. It was truth, finally, fully, quietly, and no one dared sit in that seat again. The house didn't feel like his anymore. Not really. Not with the way the echoes followed him like old accusations. Judge Raymond Cutler, once spoken with pride, now whispered with distance, shuffled down the hallway that used to greet him with warmth. It didn't anymore. It was just quiet now. Heavy, quiet. The kind that made you aware of your own breath. He paused at the kitchen counter. Mail stacked up in a messy pile, some of it torn open and abandoned mid-read. A newspaper face down revealed a headline beneath the mug ring. Judge resigns amid federal probe. Another tabloid called him the man behind the mask. The picture was old, but the eyes in it looked scared. Or maybe that's just how he saw them now. He tried his daughter again. 1 ring, 2. Voicemail. "Hi, you've reached..." He hung up. His phone buzzed again. A different name. One from Washington. A man who used to shake his hand before panels. "You're toxic now. Best to lay low." He didn't respond. He never did. He poured coffee, then let it sit. The steam faded fast. He stood at the window, but his eyes didn't focus. Outside, nothing moved. No cars, no press, not anymore. He turned on the TV. Didn't even care what channel. They were all playing the same clip anyway. courtroom screens lighting up. Amara's face calm, his face cracked open in freeze frame. The robe slouched over his shoulders. The moment everything changed. No one talked about his career now, only what he'd hidden, only who he hurt. He looked at the chair by the fireplace. Empty. His wife's scarf still draped over the armrest. She hadn't come back. Not after the hearing. Not after the papers. Not after the truth filled their house the way he used to. He opened the drawer in the study. The wedding photo sat face down just as he left it. Next to it, the robe, folded, stiff, untouched. He ran a finger along its seam. It used to feel powerful. Now it felt foreign, heavy, even off his body. The stitching itched at his memory. He hadn't been charged. He hadn't lost his pension. He hadn't gone to prison. But he had been remembered, not for justice, not for fairness, but for what he'd always been behind the bench, a man whose power was never meant to be held, and that, he realized, was the sentence no one had to write. The breeze in the park was gentle, but steady. Amara sat on the bench near, the statue of the old courthouse founder, a man who had written laws that excluded people who looked like her. She didn't look at it. She didn't need to. Her eyes followed a group of children running across the grass instead, their laughter reminding her of something she used to believe about justice, that it had to be loud to be real. Now, she knew better. The coat she wore had belonged to her mother. Deep navy, neatly pressed, the same one she wore the day Amara got her first job in court. It still carried a quiet weight in the shoulders, not heavy, just full of memory, of women who had been silenced with grace. A passing couple recognized her. The man nodded respectfully, the woman smiled, then whispered something as they walked by. Amara heard it, but didn't respond. She's the one who brought the judge down. But that wasn't how she saw it. She had turned down the university panels, let others take the mic. She didn't need her face on a magazine. She didn't want a brand. She just wanted space. And now the world was starting to make room. When the city council announced the renaming of the Justice Hall, a local news anchor had called her for comment. She only said, "Make sure it's open." To the public. Always. No press release. No speech. When the email about the scholarship came through, a fund in her name, built to support whistleblowers of color in law, she forwarded it to her attorney with one sentence. "Let's make it real. No signature. No flourish." A law student approached that afternoon, gripping his backpack too tight, his voice uncertain. "Miss Lewis?" She looked up. "Yes." He sat beside her, careful not to intrude. After a long pause, he asked, "How did you stay calm through all that?" She waited. Watched the wind rustle the trees. Then finally, without looking at him, because the rage would have made me like them, I chose the long fight. The student didn't answer. He didn't need to. He just nodded like something inside him had settled. That's what people didn't understand. She had never yelled, never thrown anything, never demanded the spotlight. But still, she'd shaken something loose, quietly, permanently. Some wrote articles about her. Some called her the quiet storm. Some called her the system's reckoning. But she never called herself anything, because survival wasn't something she did to be admired. It was just something she had to do. And now, the applause came, in ways she didn't need to answer. So she gave them silence. And in that silence, they finally started to hear. The ground was still damp from last night's rain. Amara knelt slowly, careful not to disturb the soil that had already settled. Slayao. Marble marker stood simple and unadorned, just the way her mother would have wanted it. No gold lettering, no long inscription. Just her name. And a date that still caught Amara's throat if she looked at it too long. She didn't speak. She didn't have to. The folded ruling in her hand was older now, corners soft, creases worn. But it still held weight. She laid it gently beneath the single rose, pressing it into the grass like an offering or a final punctuation mark. In the distance, church bells chimed. Not for a funeral, not for a wedding. Just the slow rhythm of mourning, the kind that made people stop for half a second before resuming their lives. The world had moved on. Headlines shifted to new names, new trials. But something had changed, quietly, and she could feel it in the places no one else looked. Her name had made its way into the back of textbooks. A footnote at first, then a case study. She heard her story discussed in a law school hallway once, overheard a student say, she never raised her voice and still they listened. That mattered more than applause ever had. The judge's bench had not remained empty for long. But its new occupant, a young black woman, carried herself differently, not louder, just clearer, like someone who had walked into the room knowing what silence could do. Amara didn't believe in systems being fixed, not completely, but she believed in cracks, in the way they let light leak in and stay. Back in her car, she unlocked an old folder on her phone. The voice memo still sat there, untouched. For years, she pressed play. Her mother's voice filled the car. Tired but sure. Your silence will be your weapon. And your dignity, your victory. Amara let it play all the way through. No tears, just breath. Then, without hesitation, she deleted it. Not out of pain, but because it was already inside her. She looked once more at the courthouse as she drove past. The flags still flew, the same brick, the same doors. But it didn't feel like it used to. It didn't feel like something she had to carry anymore. She didn't need the building's validation. She had turned it into something else, a place that now had to remember her. As the city faded behind her, Amara thought about all the voices that never made it to court, the ones still waiting, still whispering, and she knew this. They weren't forgotten, because she had sat where they couldn't. She had spoken without yelling, and they had heard her. That was the legacy, not the scandal, not the trial, but the silence that stayed when the truth finally sat down, and this time, no one had the power to make it leave.